Well, Mosaic, I don't know about you, but it's good for me to be reminded that my hope has a name and that the flaws of me is not what defines my world. And his name is Jesus. You guys can go ahead and grab a seat. And as you do, I just want to say what's up. I am excited to be up here preaching. If you don't know me, my name is Ryan. I'm the community director here at Mosaic. And you're joining us in the middle of a series called OG Church, where we're taking a look at a few distinctives of the early church that led them to flourish in the face of culture that live life differently. And our goal in the series is to learn from their example so we can set the example for the culture around us. Now, specifically today, we've got a bit of a spicy topic. We're talking about how to be people who don't retaliate in the moments where we're wronged. And you might be thinking that's not that spicy, but it's just life. I don't know about you, but when my kids give me a look, because I was up here a couple years ago with family dedication with my own children, and when my 4, 5, and 6-year-old give me a look, I want to retaliate. When the guy cuts me off in traffic, I want to retaliate. When the Starbucks employee doesn't acknowledge my presence, I want to burn the place to the ground. Based on your laughter, I don't think maybe I'm the only one. But it's in those moments that I realize my pettiness knows no bounds, and I'm assuming you can relate. And here's the thing. This whole problem didn't really start with us. It actually ties back to humanity long before you and I were ever on the scene. See, a few hundred years before the law of Moses was written in the Bible, there was a Babylonian king named Hammurabi. Hammurabi served as the king of Babylon from 1792 to 1750 BC. He's most famously known for a system of justice called the Code of Hammurabi. This code consisted of 282 laws with punishments that varied based on social status of the offender and social status of the victim. And that legal code set the tone for many legal structures that would come after. It's even displayed in courthouses throughout the United States, including the Supreme Court. Most of it is legal jargon that you and I probably haven't heard of or really paid attention to, but there's a few laws that you've definitely heard of, like an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And this section of the code was commonly called the laws of retaliation. And it was designed to help resolve altercations between people, provide opportunities for justice, and kill the possibility of blood feuds that could last for generations. See, under this law, if you got into a fight with somebody and their eye was gouged out in that fight, you were responsible to compensate them for the loss of their eye. Or if you couldn't pay, you may lose your own eye. And here's the thing that I really found interesting as I researched this. Those laws in that book were not written to instruct people on how to exact their revenge. They were written to limit the amount of revenge that one could get when he was wronged. See, because what was true then, thousands of years before Christ, I think is true today, thousands of years after Christ. And that's this: when it comes to vengeance, we're not good at fighting fair when we're fighting to get even. We don't tend to just try and get even. We go overboard. And it's been happening since the beginning of time, like literally since the beginning of time. The first set of sons we see in the Bible are named Cain and Abel. They're the sons of Adam and Eve, the original couple. Cain and Abel both bring sacrifices to the Lord. Both sacrifices would have been acceptable, except that their attitudes are different about the whole thing. The Bible says Abel brings a sacrifice that was the best that he had. Cain brings a sacrifice that's just some of what he had. And God accepts Abel's sacrifice and condemns Cain's because he didn't want Cain's leftovers. It wasn't about the specifics of what they were bringing. It was about the posture of the heart that was bringing it. See, God wanted Cain to know, I don't want a piece of you. I want all of you. Bring me your best. I'm giving you my best. Instead of repenting and owning it, bringing a different sacrifice, Cain chooses violence and kills his brother because he was embarrassed. You know why he way overreacted and killed his brother? Because he wasn't good at fighting fair when he was fighting to get even. Later in the Bible, we see this town called Nineveh disrespect the people of Israel and turn away from God. And then God calls one of his prophets named Jonah, and he says, Jonah, I want you to go to Nineveh and teach those people about my grace. Jonah responds with, I'm good. I'm going to run away. I wish they'd go to hell because I don't want to offer them a chance to receive your grace. He would literally rather have a nation of people spend eternity away from their Creator because they disrespected his people. You know why he did that? Because he wasn't good at fighting fair when he was fighting to get even. Thousands of years later, Jesus comes on the scene. He would upset the power dynamics of his day and expose some of the religious elites. And in response, the religious leaders got him falsely accused of treason and hung him on a cross. Guess why? Because they weren't good at fighting fair when they were fighting to get even. Doesn't stop there. Nero, who takes over as king, thought the earliest Christians disrespected him, so he decided to use them as human torches in his garden parties. In the Middle Ages, the Pope and the king exacted nationwide edicts on the people so they could get back at each other and prove who had the power to actually make decisions. In 2024, all you have to do is watch a political debate, take a look at cancel culture, or check out the battle between Kendrick and Drake to see acts of vengeance that get out of hand quickly. If you know, you know. We see it play out on a global scale too. Situations like Russia and Ukraine, Israel and Hamas, America's war in the Middle East, and plenty of others. I'm sure if you take a minute and just do an inventory of your own life, you can name moments where things got out of hand quickly. Whether it was a friend, a coworker, a boss, a spouse, or a child, we've all been wronged and then said things and done things that we wish we could take back. And it's because we're not good at fighting fair when we're fighting to get even. And while that might be true of humanity throughout history, the early church, the OG church, was actually known for something vastly different. They were known for something that stood in a stark contrast to the norms of their day. Here's what they were known for. In a world of violence and vengeance, the church was known for its gentleness and pursuit of reconciliation. Now, one quick side note that I just want to give this morning is I think it would be simpler for us to keep this conversation on a global scale and discuss public policy about what people like the Marines should do out there. It'd be easier for us to talk about what they should do instead of look at what we should do. But the message today is less about global policy and more about personal conduct. And the reason for that isn't because I just want to avoid talking about politics, it's because that's what Jesus did. See, in Jesus' day, this idea of vengeance was so prevalent that Caesar Augustus, the guy who was the ruler over top of Rome at that time, he prayed to the Roman god Mars, asking for help finding the two people who killed his uncle Julius. After successfully avenging the death of Julius, he vowed to build a temple to Mars, and 40 years later, Caesar would build the largest temple he ever built to the god of vengeance. It's called the Temple of Mars Altor, or Mars the Avenger, and you can still visit its ruins today in Rome. As a flex, Augustus used the temple to host military and political leaders from other nations when making agreements or just discussing foreign policy. It was like his subtle, or really not so subtle way of promising that not only would Rome fight back, but the very God of vengeance would be coming against you if you attempted to break your deal with him. And then by the time Jesus steps onto the scene, Rome has been in control of the Jewish people for the past 60 years. When Rome originally invaded, they chose to occupy the nation of the Jewish nation. And if you're not familiar with that term, it just meant that they moved part of their military forces into town. They would assign a king or a governor to oversee the daily lives of the people. And then they recruited Jewish people to turn their backs on other Jewish people and collect heavy taxes on behalf of Rome. And those three things didn't enslave the people, but it definitely crippled them. Many Jews in that time thought that the Messiah that they were waiting on would be a military leader who'd lead the revolt and free their people from Roman rule. In trying to understand if Jesus was the guy for the role, multiple times we find him being questioned. One time it's by a group of Pharisees who questioned him about paying taxes. And they juxtapose this big question. They want to know, should we pay taxes to Caesar or should we tithe to God? And Jesus kind of gives this famous answer where he goes, well, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what was God's. He didn't really seem to answer their question, but he just made it simple. It was because he didn't seem interested in fighting the power. He wasn't preoccupied with the occupation of Rome. Instead, he wanted to change the hearts of people. And even though Jesus wasn't consumed with Rome and its oppression on the people, it is important for us to understand the context in which Jesus speaks to the people of his day. Theologian and biblical historian Tim Mackey explains that the understood cultural context for the words of Jesus are spoken to a subjugated ethnic religious minority group under an imperial power. People who are being oppressed, who disagree with what their government's doing, who have questions about everything that's happening around them. And it's into that context that Jesus would deliver one of his most well-known sermons called the Sermon on the Mount. If you want to look it up, you can find it in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. And you'll see him start by blessing the people. These are people who are wondering where God is and if God's listening. And Jesus says things like, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And blessed are the persecuted who are doing right, because the kingdom of heaven will be theirs. He gives encouragement to the people who are struggling, and he wants them to know that God actually sees them. And then he begins to unpack the nature and the philosophy of his ministry and what he wants his kingdom on earth to look like. And he doesn't teach them so much what to do, but much more he focuses on teaching them how to think. And he would do this by quoting common laws and phrases of their day, and then expose the flawed philosophy underneath and call them to something greater. For example, John taught this one a couple weeks ago. He said, "You've heard it said you shouldn't commit adultery. But I say, anyone who looks at a woman with lust in their heart has already sinned against her and committed adultery in his own heart." Another verse, "You've heard it said, you shall not murder. But I say, anybody who holds on to anger and bitterness in their hearts against somebody has done the same in his murder." And just to be clear, Jesus wasn't confused that lust and anger have different earthly consequences than adultery and murder. But he did understand, and he wanted his followers specifically to understand, that the emotional and spiritual consequences of bottling up their darkness was just as detrimental to them living out their faith as it would be if they would actually just act on it. And it's in this series of cultural corrections that we find the scripture we're studying today. Check it out in Matthew 5:38. He says, "You've heard the law that says the punishment must match the injury." This is Code of Hammurabi. "An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say, don't resist an evil person. If somebody slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek also. If you're sued in court and your shirt's taken from you, give them your coat too. If a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, I want you to carry it for 2 miles. Give to those who ask, and don't turn away from those who want to borrow." And to make sure that we fully don't get lost in this passage, but that we get everything out of it, I want to break this thing down phrase by phrase so we can understand exactly what's going on here and learn what Jesus is actually calling his followers to do. And if we can do that, I'm convinced that it'll help us get a better grasp of what these verses are actually calling us to do in the face of our own adversity. So let's go back to the first one. He says, "I say, don't resist an evil person. If somebody slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek also." Now, one quick thing to note, this phrase, "don't resist an evil person," up here at the top, is translated from a Greek word that had 2 different meanings. Sometimes it meant don't respond at all, but most of the time it meant don't respond in the same way, or don't respond in kind. And I don't have time to break all of this down, but scholars much smarter than me agree that Jesus is saying here, don't respond the same way of how they've treated you, not don't respond at all. The second part of this verse gives us an example of that. If somebody slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek also. Now, similar to today, in Roman times, slapping somebody on the cheek was much more about calling them out than it was hurting them. If you wanted to knock them out, if you were in a fight with somebody and you wanted to knock them out, you'd punch them with a closed fist. But a slap was meant to demand their attention, and it could be done in one of 2 ways. First, it could be done as a backhand. This was to show power and disgust. It was a way to communicate to someone that they were lower than you. The second way to slap somebody was with an open hand. It was a common practice if you wanted to call out an equal or a superior, you'd slap them with an open hand, not a backhand. So which one's Jesus talking about here? Well, he refers to being slapped on the right cheek, which for every right-handed person in his day would have meant a backhand. He was talking to the day worker who had been mistreated and talked down to. He's speaking to the woman or the child that's been made to feel less than, and he's teaching them that when somebody treats you as a second-class citizen, I want you to offer them an opportunity to treat you as their equal. See, Jesus didn't believe in second-class citizens or second-class humans. Routinely, we see him raise the value of the people who are rejected by speaking to the intrinsic value of what it means to be human. So when Jesus teaches his people to turn the other cheek, he's not saying, hey, I want you to be a punching bag to the abuser. No, that's not it at all. He's teaching them how to respond when they've been disrespected and downgraded. It's like he knew what their natural reaction would be, and that would be to power up in the face of power, to match disrespect with more disrespect. But he's calling them to something greater than vengeance or vindication. He's calling them to gentleness and self-control. See, Jesus is telling us that when we're tempted to retaliate, He wants us to choose to respond. See, retaliation, when you look it up in the dictionary, it says it's the act of harming someone because they have harmed you. It's all about getting revenge. Devalue them because they devalued me. Responding, on the other hand, as I'm referencing it, responding is about making an intentional decision and being intentional in your actions. It treats other people with value regardless of how they treat you, and it asks them to do the same for you. Retaliation leads to more division. A well thought out response can lead to healing. So when you're tempted to retaliate, choose to respond. Specifically, choose to respond calmly and provide an opportunity for the relationship to be reconciled and for you to be treated as a human. So this whole idea of being treated as human reminds me of a photo from the civil rights movement of the late 60s. This picture is from a sanitation union worker strike in Memphis, Tennessee. And you see people up here with signs about union justice and things like that, but the majority of people, and if you get photos that are zoomed out for this, the majority of men in this protest wore a sign that simply said, "I am a man." The whole point of this, for those people wearing that sign, was to say, you're dehumanizing me. I'm not less than. I'm not a black man. I'm not less than you. I'm just a man. Treat me as a man. They didn't waste their time and their energy trying to devalue those on the other side of the argument. Instead, they treated them with dignity. It was just a peaceful protest that offered the oppressor an opportunity to treat them with dignity as well. So when you're tempted to power up, when you want to retaliate, when you want to show your force, respond with gentleness and dignity. It leads us into our second challenge from Jesus. Take a look at this verse. If you're sued in court and your shirt is taken from you, give them your coat too. Now, this second example was about someone suing you for the shirt off your back. And for the crowd Jesus was speaking to, this would have been extremely jarring to hear, and here's why. The average working class person owned one or two outfits at most. Their outfit consisted of a tunic or a shirt and a coat. For day workers like shepherds and farmers, they would have worn their tunic at all times. Their coat they would have put on when it was cold, and every single night they would have used their coat as their blanket. The coat was so necessary of an item that if somebody sued you for your coat, the law said you had to return it each evening before dark because it would be the person's blanket and their way to stay warm. So to get around having to interact with the person that you just sued, the accuser would sue workers for their shirt instead. That way they didn't have to return it or see them until they were paid back their debt. But as you can imagine, wearing a scratchy wool coat with nothing underneath was inconvenient and uncomfortable and near impossible on a hot day. And this type of lawsuit was a fairly common practice used by a greedy person to exploit the weakness of a common person unable to afford the unjust lawsuit. Many times, it was a landowner suing a day worker for not producing enough that day. And when the worker couldn't defend themselves or pay off the fine, the accuser would just demand their inner garment as collateral until it was paid back or until they worked off their deal. To be clear, this lawsuit wasn't about need. It was about greed. It was a way of oppressing those less than you, and it treated them as help instead of humans. But Jesus instructs his followers to respond to their greed with generosity and vulnerability. To give them your coat too wasn't just generous in the face of greed, it was vulnerable because it left you naked in the street. Like, if these people literally gave up their tunic and their coat, they were left with nothing but a pair of sandals. And I don't know whether or not Jesus literally wanted his followers to be left naked in the street, and we could discuss that later. But this act and what Jesus is calling them to was meant to subvert greed with generosity and offer an opportunity for grace. It was intended to jar the system of the accuser and shift their heart so the accused could get back to good. I don't know about you, but as I think about responding to greedy people with generosity, my initial response is, no thank you. I've dealt with people just like you have. I don't mean just like you. I'm saying we've all dealt with people. We've all dealt with people who are greedy. Not you're greedy, you get it. Or you don't. Email Jonathan at Mosaic Christian. Either way, We've all dealt with people who are greedy for our money, our time, our energy, our knowledge, and so much more. Regardless of how much you or I give, it never seems to be enough, and it never seems to satisfy their insatiable desire that greed is driving. And in those situations, I'd rather avoid them than give into it. I'd rather walk away than stare down the accusation. And if that's your tendency, if you can relate to that, I want you to write this down. When you're tempted to isolate, choose to engage. See, walking away from people, avoiding conflict and accusations might be easier, but it doesn't lead to what's best. Jesus was teaching his followers, and he's teaching us how to deal with people who want to take advantage of us. The solution isn't to power up, but it's also not to run and hide. The solution is to shift what we value. For the greedy person, in Jesus' example of a lawsuit, they value power and a few dollars more than they value people. And when those being sued would respond with generosity, it would disarm the power struggle. It was no longer a contest based on net worth or social status because one person just dismissed those things as irrelevant. So dollars were no longer the measuring stick. All of a sudden, generosity was. And this response provided an opportunity for the greedy to choose generosity as well. So when you find yourself tempted to isolate from greedy people who are demanding something of you, choose to engage with those around you and work to build the relationship with the people in your life that are hardest for you to love. Just a couple verses after this passage in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus would say this: "You've heard the law that says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Remember, Jesus is preaching this sermon and inviting his followers to consider what it would be to establish a new kingdom here on earth. And it wasn't meant to mimic the world around them. He wasn't concerned with making it easy, but he did want to make it simple. He said, the world says, love those who can love you back. But I'm calling you to something greater. I'm saying, love those who oppose you. That means when we choose to engage with difficult people and when we choose to meet greed with generosity, it provides an opportunity for us to build the kingdom that Jesus had come to establish. I don't know about you, but living in 2024, I find it easy to fight against people who say things about me instead of actually engage with them in a real conversation. But the call from Christ is to engage in that conversation, not run away. Leads us into our third example. The third and final example Jesus gives is about carrying a soldier's gear for an extra mile. It's got a weird cultural context, but I'll explain in a second. Jesus says, if a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, carry it for 2. And the whole premise behind this idea was based on a Roman law that limited how much the Roman soldiers could oppress the nation of Israel. The government didn't come out and say, don't oppress the people. It just said, you can't take advantage of the people too much. And so this law allowed any Roman soldier to demand that any Israelite carry his gear for him for a mile. It didn't matter which direction they were going or which direction you were going. You could just make them carry your gear for 1,000 steps. Obviously, the people would have been frustrated about this because it was a sign of power and authority. It was a flex. It felt like bullying. Imagine for a second that you're a man working in the field with your 2 young boys. When 2 soldiers come by, drop their stuff at your feet, and order you to pick it up and carry it for them for 1,000 steps. Not only does it take you away from your task, it's humiliating. Like, it's the feeling of being bullied. And most of us, when we were in middle school and we experienced bullying, we spent our time plotting our revenge and figuring out a way that we could get even, a way that we could make them pay for what they did to us. And I don't think the followers of Jesus were any different. But Jesus steps into that plotting and scheming, and he says, hey, when you're being bullied and when you feel humiliated, I don't want you to spend the mile plotting your revenge. Spend it building the relationship. And when you get done a mile, go another mile. And allow your generosity and your service to be an opportunity for relationship instead of revenge. See, Jesus was teaching them when it would be easier to make excuses, choose to set the example. The people listening would have been stunned at Jesus' call, not just to submit to the Roman government, but to give beyond what the Roman government had demanded of them. They would have been even more stunned when they watched Jesus live this out in the face of his own adversity. In Matthew 26, near the end of Jesus' life, we find Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's begging God to save him from death on the cross. He knew what was ahead of him, and he didn't want to do it. As far as I know, this is the only time that Jesus prays to change, for God to change his mind and not do what he had planned. Ultimately, he submits to God's call, but as he's praying, a group of soldiers arrive to arrest him. One of Jesus' closest friends, named Peter, had been asked to pray with Jesus, but he fell asleep. He gets startled, he wakes up, and cuts off a man's ear. Take a look. It says, one of the men with Jesus pulled out his sword and struck the high priest's slave, slashing off his ear. Jesus immediately corrects him. Put away your sword. Those who use the sword will die by the sword. Don't you realize that I could ask my Father for thousands of angels to protect us, and he would send them instantly? Now, if you're familiar with the story, you know that Jesus didn't just correct Peter in the moment. He also healed the man's ear before they arrested him. In the beginning of the message this morning, we said we'd learn from Jesus and the early church about how to respond in adversity without responding in the same way as the world around us. And here's where he models it for us. When his accusers came at him with aggression and with force, he teaches Peter to put down his sword, because we don't retaliate and match force with force. We respond. And when it would have been easier for him to isolate and run away, if he could have called in 1,000 angels, he could have gone into super speed mode and got out of there if he wanted. When it would have been easier to isolate, he chooses to engage. I've thought about this a lot, but Jesus healing that man's ear wasn't necessary, but was what he chose to do, and it was a blessing to that guy. And then, when this would have been the ideal time for Jesus to make some excuses, he chooses to set the example and serve those who hate him. See, by taking the time to heal the man's ear, he not only blesses the man, he saves Peter's life. Because according to those ancient codes of law, attacking a representative of the high priest would have been a capital offense. But with no evidence of that actually happening, there was no case to be had. And throughout Jesus' ministry here on earth, he sought reconciliation for both the abused and the abuser, the accused and the accuser. And this moment in the garden was no different. Jesus offered healing and grace to everyone that he came in contact with. If you find yourself here this morning in need of reconciliation with the God of the universe, Jesus is offering you the same grace. All you have to do is check the baptism box on your connection card. Somebody from our team is going to reach out this week and have a conversation about what it means to follow Jesus and help you take that step. But if you're like me and you're wondering, well, how do we actually get there, Ryan? In the beginning, you said, we're going to learn to not retaliate, but I still don't know how to do that. Well, it takes training. Moving from reactionary to intentional doesn't happen overnight. It requires a rewiring of our minds and our bodies so that we can show up differently. In 1 Timothy 4, Paul would write to Timothy and tell him to train himself to be godly. He says physical training is good, but training for godliness is so much better because it promises benefits in this life and in the life to come. And if we in 2024 are going to be people who respond but don't respond in kind, we're going to have to train ourselves for godliness. So as we close this morning and accept the challenge to start training ourselves for godliness, I know some of you might have a pushback. Like some of you feel like there's no coming back because your anger and your retaliation has already gotten out of hand and you've already lost the things that you can't redeem. Others feel like their anger is so hardwired into who they are that reacting differently just isn't possible. And others still are afraid and aware that if we choose to react differently, if we actually follow what Jesus says, it might mean that I get run over, and I'm just not willing to let that happen again. But regardless of what reason you have, Jesus still is calling us to react differently than the world around us, and that's going to take a retraining of our mind, and I just happen to know a little bit about that. Back in January, I was in a car accident where I got rear-ended by a pickup truck going about 50 miles an hour. I was dead stopped. I blacked out at the moment of impact, and then a few moments later, somebody from Mosaic who just happens to live down my road opened my car door because he was checking on the guy who was in the accident. Had no idea it was me. When I started to come to, I looked at him and was like, "Hey, Nathan, I can't talk right now. I'm in traffic." And he was like, "You've been in a bad accident." And I was like, "I don't think so." And I just wasn't there, if I'm honest. For the next few minutes, I started to process like the chaos that was my car and this situation. I just kept saying, I don't know what happened. Within a few minutes, I was being transported to Hopkins, and a series of scans and tests revealed I was okay. Nothing was broken, but I likely had a concussion, for sure. I eventually met with a concussion specialist who told me to start in physical therapy and begin to retrain my brain because my eyes and my brain weren't working well together. And you might be sitting here wondering, what kind of exercises do you have to do to retrain your eyes and your brain? Let me show you, all right? We're gonna have to really zoom in this camera because it's hard to see, all right? Here's what I had to do. I had to hold up 2 pens, all right? My fingers are gonna represent those pens, and then I would look at one finger, and then look at the other, and then look at one, and look at the other, and then look at one, and then look at the other. And I'd do 3 sets of 10 of those. Come on, it's a good workout, all right? And then when I'd get done 3 sets of 10 of those, I'd get to go to these, all right? And then I would do, look at that one, look at that one, look at that one, look at that one. And I would do that, and about the second set on those eye motions of up and down, I'd have to stop because my brain and my eyes were exhausted. And my PT person, Stephanie, would look at me and go, how you feeling? And I was just like, I feel stupid. And she goes, well, you need to rest, you're working out. I'm like, I'm not lifting weights. She said it as if I just like benched my max. But I felt so dumb. I just wanted to be good, but I wasn't there. And it didn't even feel like I could even make progress. 4 months later is how long it took. I wasn't sure if it was ever going to happen, but over time, with vulnerability to go back to the basics, healing ultimately began to happen. My body began to get better. My brain started to process correctly again. And I'd love to tell you that I'm totally back and everything's perfect, but that's going to take a lot more time because I'm learning to rework a muscle that's been dormant for a few months now. But as you begin to start training yourself for godliness, you know what you're going to find? You're going to find what I found in PT. You're going to find new areas where it hurts. You're going to find times when you're tired and fatigued and ready to give up. You'll find times where you mess up along the way because you're wiring yourself for something new. But when you mess up, repent and receive grace and then get back after it because it's worth it. Your relationships are worth getting this right. Your marriage and your parenting are worth rewiring your retaliation. You are worth rewiring your desire for vengeance. So next time you find yourself wanting to retaliate, choose to respond and respond gently. When you want to run away and isolate, choose to engage. When you want to make excuses, choose to set the example. The community you're in and the world around you needs us to do what the OG church did. In the face of adversity, they responded with gentleness and reconciliation. Let's pray. God, I am thankful for who you are. I am thankful that you are a good God who didn't choose to retaliate against your humanity. We wronged you, and you still chose to respond in love, in the desire of reconciliation, not retaliation. So God, would you help us to be people who model what you modeled for us? Would you help us do the hard work of stepping in and beginning to rewire our brains so that you can do the work through us that you want to do in your world? It's in your name I pray. Amen.